today at the Shropshire Museum's Collection Centre. I'm Sarah Skelton.
And I'm Emma Kate Lanyon, and we're both curators here for Shropshire Museum Service.
We've come together to discuss various women of science inspired by the question, what if Darwin had been born a woman?
Yes, I mean, I thought that was a fascinating question that a student came up with quite recently, and it got me thinking about that topic and the fact that when we think about sort of 19th century science, we think about the great men like Darwin, and there's very little evidence of sort of women being an active part of that. And I think traditionally the role of women in science has been kind of hidden or even erased. And it only seems to be in sort of the last 40 years that people are now starting to explore some of those biographies and discovering more and more women. And I think we've certainly seen, as we've been going through the collection, that there are all these women's stories that actually haven't been noticed before. And a lot of them are really fascinating people.
That's right. It's almost as if you scratch the surface and suddenly, once you choose to look, like with so much of science, those things are there, the evidence is there for these women, but they just weren't explored before. Their contribution wasn't seen or acknowledged, or, as you say, it was hidden or sort of sometimes deliberately erased, but mostly it just seems to be that the light was not shone upon those people and what they were doing.
Yes, and I mean, we've still got a gender bias in science today. I mean, traditionally people always think of a scientist being a man, and papers that are attributed to men are often seen as being more kind of academic and accurate than those by women. And I think, although we've come a long way, that actually when we go back in history, it was a lot harder for women than it is even today.
Yeah, of course, their circumstances would have been different. There was different form of education for women and different fields that it was acceptable for them to operate within. And even, many societies, many scientific societies, even the most eminent ones, simply didn't accept women members, did they?
Yes, yeah, that's true. And I think what's interesting is if we go right the way back to sort of the Regency period and that first sort of flowering of science, is that there seemed to be a lot more women actually actively involved. And it seems to be that it was seen as a kind of acceptable thing for women to do, to be involved in. And that sort of that collecting, that drawing and studying was something that kind of tied in with their traditional education of women. And I think there's more of a kind of a balance there. But then as you move into the 19th century and you get sort of the sciences developing as kind of strong, independent disciplines.
Once they're more established,
yes,
and more sort of formed, suddenly there's no place for women.
Yes, yes. But even that actually that science is sort of pushing women out by saying, we're not sure actually that women's minds are strong enough to cope with the sort of the process of science and mathematics. It might be dangerous to their health to be involved. And you seem to get this split between men who are kind of accepting of women and others who feel that really their place is at home as a wife and a mother, not actually as a scientist.
It tells you a lot about women's power in society, that women weren't autonomous. They didn't have that ownership over their own sort of interests and mental space, which is really interesting, isn't it, when we look back at that?
Yeah, and I think you've also got then things like the great man theory coming in the mid-19th century, where suddenly history is all about individuals who had a huge contribution to make to history. And I think that pushes out a lot of people who are collaborating with others and pushes them to the side. And I think that's true of both men and women who weren't the kind of the headline act in science at the time.
Yeah, you get those superstars, just like we see in scientific fields today. You get very few people who attract a lot of attention, and then there's many thousands beavering away quietly in labs and all over the world.
Yes, and I mean, I think Darwin and evolution is one example of that, is that those others that contributed and were having similar thoughts and ideas at the same time are pushed aside regardless of their gender.
So what happened to these women? Did women stop participating in science?
I mean, I think they sort of stepped into the shadows slightly, but I mean, certainly there were women who were kind of ingenious enough to find ways to still collaborate and work in science. And I think a lot of them sort of had to step back slightly, and their role of as a mother or as a wife had to sort of take precedence. And I think that's where people like Sarah, who we'll talk about later, was really interesting, because Sarah Price managed to balance that being a wife and mother with actually pursuing her scientific interests as well.
Yeah, and of course Mary McGee never married, so she didn't have that barrier, but then she had her mixed ethnicity, which certainly would have been unusual at the time for her to be so active in the fields that she was working in.
Yes, I mean, she must have been a very strong woman to survive in a world where being a single woman and a woman of mixed race as well must have made it quite hard for her. So I think she must have been a fascinating person.
Very determined.
Yes, yeah. And I think the role of women as educators is kind of overlooked as well, is that they were the mothers or the governesses who were kind of bringing on the next generation. So they were passing on an understanding of science and kind of the latest theories to young people, and bringing on people like Darwin. Darwin and his contemporary, Frederick William Hope, both met Catherine Plymley, who was governess to some of their friends. And it would be interesting to imagine some of the conversations that they may have had.
Yes, all the knowledge she would have shared that she had amassed through her amazing artworks.
Yes.
Sharing that with the next generation. But again, that's not recorded, is it? Nobody's minuting those conversations that she had with that next generation.
Yeah.
So what do we know about women and their participation in science in Shropshire?
So we know the Ludlow Natural History Society allowed women members.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because that wasn't normal. A lot of the larger organisations like the Royal Society in London were exclusive to men. I haven't been able to establish whether the Shrewsbury Natural History Society was letting women in as well. But what I thought was fascinating was when I looked at the accession register. So this is 1885, so this is the year that they've established themselves. They're starting to build up a collection and move towards the museum. That actually there were quite a few women who had actually given donations. There's one here, a Miss Bowman of Shrewsbury, and she gives quite an extensive collection here. We've got over 50 shells, nearly 80 insects. There's minerals, there's fossils. So she'd obviously amassed quite a collection before she then handed it on. There are other people like Miss Layton here, who was giving a collection of mushrooms. I imagine she was probably a relative of the Layton who helped establish the society and was so involved in the study of flora and fungi of Shropshire.
And who Mary McGee supported and helped.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So there's quite an interesting mix here of wives and daughters who are actually wanting to become involved in the society and add to its collections.
So they might not be able to feature in a paper or write a paper themselves, but we have the physical evidence of their contributions in the collections that we care for today.
Yes, yeah. Well, shall we explore some of these women a little bit more?
Yes, let's. So, tell me, who was Catherine Plymley?
Well, Catherine is a really fascinating person. She seems to have been involved in a whole range of different areas. She was a naturalist. She was particularly interested in insects and botany. She was a diarist. She was a radical and a campaigner. So she was a woman who really had a wealth of interests, but it really focused down on this sort of study of insects. She was born in 1758 in Longnar, and her father was an apothecary. So both her and her sister were involved in helping him. So, I mean, there's a lovely little apothecary's chest here. And she would have been involved in preparing some of the medicines and preparations. At this time, a lot of them are all plant-based, so she would have needed a good knowledge of both identifying and the properties of different plants to help with that sort of side of things.
How interesting, because of course a lot of insects are their life cycles are so connected to the food source plants and in all sorts of other ways. So I suppose she would have seen that from a very early age firsthand.
Yes. And I mean, she was keeping insects. She was actually propagating the plants that they ate. And she was producing these beautiful illustrations that show the life cycle of a moth, right from the laying of the eggs to the larvae and then the adults. So she was really involved in the life cycle of these insects and studying them and sharing the information that she was gathering with others. There was another entomologist in Shropshire, Frederick William Hope, who was a curate just outside Shrewsbury. And she was swapping notes and information with him.
Oh, great.
So yes, beautiful illustration work that underlies all this scientific study.
And actually, I mean, that's what's interesting about her illustrations, isn't it? That they, as you say, they show that whole life cycle often. And that's much more information than you get in a tray of pinned butterflies. So that is really interesting that she's thinking about their actual lives rather than just looking at them.
Yes, and quite often on the back of these illustrations there will be meticulous notes about when each stage happened, what food sources that they preferred, if there were sort of two different plants that they usually ate. So, I mean, she was really sort of gathering information. Her sister as well was part of this, so together they built up quite an extensive collection of geology was one of her sister's particular interests, but also shells and lichens. So they were part of this sort of great collecting discipline as well.
Immersed in the natural world.
Yes,
Yeah, and what they could learn.
Well, I think that's one of the fascinating things about her diaries. I mean, she kept over 200 notebooks of information, and they covered everything from the conversations that were going on in the family drawing room to the life of her father. So it's really comprehensive and gives us a real insight. I mean, she lived in the heart of the Industrial Revolution in Shropshire, and it was a real sort of hotbed of radical thinking. And a lot of these great sort of thinkers of the age were visiting the house and having conversations, and Catherine was in there as part of that debate and then writing notes later. They were discussing everything from the principles behind the French Revolution to the reform of the electoral process in Britain. She was talking about the abolition of slavery. So there was no sort of topic that was sort of off the cards, that they were really sort of debating the big questions of that age that were really shaping and forming the modern world.
How amazing. Well, no wonder she was so inspired to improve her own mind and pursue her own interests.
Yes, and I mean, what's lovely is that after her father died, both her and her sister hadn't married, they'd been caring for him, and they went to live with their brother and acted as governesses to his children. He had 13 children, so they had plenty of little minds to shape.
Yeah.
So they were really instrumental in educating those children and sort of exposing them to all these different subjects and ideas.
Fascinating. So they did have an output. It just isn't the same as the output we would expect today for somebody with such a pioneering brain.
Yes, and I think that was true for a lot of Regency women, that actually they couldn't be part of that kind of university debating societies or the big organisations that were being established to talk about these big ideas. But back home in the drawing room, they were having those conversations, and they were really exploring some ideas that men hadn't really got to grips with, like the sort of the social implications of science, how it was going to change people's lives and sort of culture, really. And they were sort of really talking about that. And I think Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, again, is example of the
reflects
results of that,
Yeah.
is that thinking about electricity and science and understanding human anatomy, about what will that mean for the future and how will that change people's lives.
And for people and the sort of emotional impact of those things.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, what was Catherine's sort of sphere of experience? You know, was she just living in Shropshire and living in a very sort of home-based world, or did she move about and experience life outside the county boundaries?
Well, she was really travelling. And I mean, her diaries show that she was travelling all across the country from Penzance to London, and regularly too, going out and about. And her travels really tell of that age that she lived in. I mean, she visited London and saw Herschel's telescopes. What's fascinating is that the astronomer Herschel, his sister Caroline, was a very important astronomer herself, and it would be lovely to think that perhaps her and Catherine sat and sort of had to talk about science over a cup of tea.
Yes,
She also saw Trevithick's steam engine in the early 1800s. So really, she was there at the cutting edge of all these new ideas.
So
and
she's
things.
sort of chasing around, thinking, oh, somebody's done something exciting.
Yes.
I'll go and see it.
Yes,
Yeah, fascinating. An amazing woman. So do we know how she felt about women's rights?
Well, I think what's interesting when you read her writing is the fact that she's talking about, well, you really get a feel for the kind of the restraints that women were working under, and the fact that she's very aware of the fact that a woman is kind of defined by her relationship to men, and that as a single woman that kind of limited her life experiences. And there's this sort of proto-feminist sort of feel to her writing. So she's not directly talking about the fact that that women need to kind of expand their horizons and move out of the shadows from behind men. But there is that kind of feeling that if she had lived a little later, that may have been a thought that she would have developed. And she was very aware that actually with her interests in kind of social reform and the abolition of slavery, she was very much involved in the fact that she felt that everyone should have rights and those opportunities. She supported women's education very strongly. She supported the idea that people should be promoted based on their experience and qualifications, not their social standing. So I think that kind of that radical experience that she had meant that she was a sort of proto-feminist.
Yeah, I mean, she saw that her world was limited by her gender and her situation.
Yes.
And that didn't sit well with her.
Yes, I mean, in her writing, she's sort of quite vocal about people who see that a woman should have a very sort of narrow field of experience, and that she really felt that that wasn't fair and that women should be given other opportunities, even if it wasn't explicit in what she was writing about.
Yeah. Did Catherine ever publish her research?
I mean, I think one of the sad things is that all these notebooks that she produced, all these drawings that she made, none of them were ever published. Her father, who had taught her illustration, he was a published illustrator, and he had published in Thomas Pennant's book on zoology. So it's a shame that that didn't continue for her, and that she got her works out there and seen. She did work very closely with her brother on a gazetteer that looked at the natural resources of Shropshire. So it looked at the agriculture and the geology of the area, that was published in 1803. And in her diary, she talks about being sat in on those conversations with all these important Shropshire scientists that were working on that. So she sort of was in on the debate, but wasn't actually cited in that work or actively contributing towards it.
Yeah, or formally acknowledged as having contributed towards it.
Yeah. And I think she kind of settled that in her own mind by seeing it as being about sort of self-development, and she wanted to learn these things for herself, not necessarily to sort of pass them on and share them. So I don't think she really saw it necessarily as important to be part of those great debates and in there developing the theories, but she saw it as her place of kind of contributing towards them and then sharing them with the next generation as an educator.
Fascinating. So what's her legacy? She wasn't published. What does she leave behind?
Well, I mean, when she died in 1829, within literally weeks of her sister, all her diaries and all her drawings stayed with the family unpublished. And it wasn't until they were then placed on loan with Shropshire Archives and the Museum Service that people have had the opportunity to start looking at those and starting to understand just how great her contribution could have been if she had actually been published at the time and had the opportunities to develop some of her ideas and share her knowledge.
Yeah, so hundreds of years had to pass before a sort of formal light could be shone upon her work.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think what's nice is there's a lovely quote from her brother that's actually on the grave of her and her sister, which says that they were women of superior minds, which were well educated, with great industry and devoted to God, and of their fellow creatures. No person, perhaps of equal means, ever contributed more to the comfort of their nearest relatives or the wants of an extended neighbourhood. And I think that just shows just how, even though their kind of discovery and scientific interests were very insular and sort of stayed within the family, that actually their knowledge was kind of recognised within their social circle.
Yes, and valued, how valued she and her sister were. Yeah,
and I think Catherine's probably quite typical of a lot of women in that period, is that they were there having these discussions with men and sort of talking through these ideas, and that they were probably helping to shape some of those great theories and formulas that were being made at the time, but just were not the kind of the headline acts in that story.
They weren't claiming the spotlight for themselves.
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. So, Mark, can you tell me, please, who was Mary McGee?
Well, Mary McGee's a fascinating person because, unlike so many of the naturalists in 19th century Shropshire, she didn't come from this part of the world at all. She was born in Jamaica, the son of a plantation owner.
Wow.
And of course, she was born in the second half of the 18th century. So that's the era of slave labour on the estates in the West Indies. And indeed, her Mary's father was an estate owner, and he became immensely wealthy through the trade across the Atlantic from the West Indies back to Britain, selling sugar and other products, I've no doubt, as well.
Yes, rum, I believe, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mary was born into very propitious circumstances for somebody to become interested in natural history, because she didn't have to worry about where her next meal was coming from, that sort of thing. She was comfortably brought up in very, very, very good circumstances. So she fitted well into the Georgian society of Ludlow when she came over to this country to live. Robert McGee, Mary and Thomas's father, died. He left tens of thousands of pounds to his descendants and relatives. So, I mean, in modern terms, he was a multi-millionaire.
Yeah,
several times over. In
it's
fact.
certainly not a sort of tokenistic gesture, is it?
No.
That's, he didn't necessarily have to do that, yet he did do that, which shows that he had that caring paternal relationship with them, as far as we can tell anyway.
But certainly Mary McGee, cast a very different shadow compared with most of the other members of the Ludlow gentry in the early 19th century. So she's a fascinating figure from that point of view, and she must have brought a very cosmopolitan flavour to what was essentially a rural community in those days.
Do we know anything more about her sort of introduction into science and the botanical world? Do we have any sort of more information?
Well, I don't, that's for sure. I haven't come across anyone else who's discovered details of her education.
No.
But, for example, we don't know whether to what extent she was educated in Jamaica or whether she was sent back to the United Kingdom. She was certainly born in Jamaica anyway. And she certainly returned to England at about the same time, presumably with her father, when he sold the estate and returned to the UK.
Yeah.
And the McGees initially settled in London, in Fitzroy Square, Russell Place, Fitzroy Square, which was a very well-to-do neighbourhood, of course. And there, one of her near neighbours was a lady called Jane Marseille, a Swiss-born naturalist who wrote popular books for lady naturalists in particular. And it's quite conceivable that the McGees and the Marseilles would have known each other, or at least that Mary McGee might have read some of Jane Marseille's literature.
Might have been aware of her, yes. How interesting. Yes, so she may have been educated at home, as a lot of women were at that time. That was generally the standard thing for sort of affluent young ladies, wasn't it? That they'd have a governess in the home who would come and educate them in the various range of subjects which were deemed as being suitable for them to be educated in. Things like literature and art and potentially some botany as well. I suppose it may be that she was mostly perhaps inspired by her childhood growing up, we assume, in Jamaica on her father's plantation. Obviously, agriculture is very intrinsically connected to botany. And perhaps that's where she got her love of studying plants and nature from, just seeing how her father enabled the land to be cultivated and how that worked for him and his very successful business, which he ran from the basis of growing sugar crops.
Yes, I'm sure that's right.
Yeah. And then when she came over to Britain, it may be that contrast with the environment, the natural world that she'd grown up in or seen in her early childhood, the contrast with British flora and the landscapes around her, maybe that was something which kind of piqued her interest again. And being in that world in London at that time with all these sort of the flourishing scientific communities, these new ideas, this new way of perceiving the world, may have sort of encouraged her to study it some more and actually, enhance her own knowledge and understanding.
Yes, I think mixing in the right circles and being in the right place at the right time would have certainly helped Mary McGee, for sure, yes.
Yeah, indeed. How fascinating. But she seems like she was a very independent person. I mean, she never married. We can only speculate as to what influence her mother had on her and her mother's experiences, who it seems very likely was at some point enslaved, even if she wasn't at all during Mary's lifetime. So that's really interesting as well. I was just thinking, her mum might have been responsible for kind of instilling a really independent spirit in her, because as you say, women didn't really have rights back then. And of course, one of the things that meant you had a bit more freedom was if you were unmarried. Once you got past a marriageable age, then, you could sort of answerable only to yourself, really, weren't you, as a woman? And that was one of the few ways where you could actually maintain that independence. Maybe that was an influence upon her as well. We just don't know.
And it's interesting as well that Mary lived apart from her brother. They didn't share a household, which they might conceively have done, since neither seemed to have been married.
So she wasn't interested in being her brother's sort of housekeeper or...
No, I think she probably had servants of her own.
Yes, I would imagine
attend to her domestic needs.
Yes, that's it, leaving her free to go off and
climb into the carriage and go off botanising every day. Yes.
Fabulous.
Well, she certainly got as far up as the Long Mynd and places like that. So that, this is before the time of the railways, of course.
Yes.
So, she must have had transport.
Yes, you
available.
didn't get to those places by accident.
No, you wouldn't have walked there and back in the day, even in those
No.
days, for sure.
No. Fascinating. So, did she publish her botanical research?
Well, I haven't come across any literature that was written by Mary and published. There are only her records, which are published in William Allport Leighton's Flora of Shropshire, which was published in 1841.
Yeah,
Three
groundbreaking
years
work.
before Mary died. So,
Yes. Yeah.
But there's no herbarium known for Mary, so if any of her specimens do still exist, no one's aware of it at the moment.
So how did she come to be involved in that? Is it right that Leighton advertised for people to contribute to the Flora of Shropshire because it was this groundbreaking, pioneering work studying the flora of the county? And was he sort of putting his feelers out saying, local botanists, please share your findings with me?
Yes, I think there would probably have been a perfectly good local network of people who were, that were interested in that subject, and they would have been very happy to correspond with each other. And Mary seems to have made her records freely available to Leighton for publication.
Yes.
To judge from his flora, anyway.
Yes, indeed, because she's cited 163 times. I mean, that's a lot, isn't it? There's not many, and she gets a specific mention as well, I noticed, in the Flora of Shropshire, where he thanks her, which is quite lovely. It's sort of it's as close to a legacy as she gets, really, isn't it, in many ways?
Yes.
What is it that Leighton says about her? He says, to Miss McGee of Ludlow, his acknowledgements are due for very comprehensive lists of plants observed either in their immediate neighbourhood or in other portions of the county.
Yes.
So she's right up there, getting her name in with all these much more established and previously recognised botanical figures. Generally, they are men. So she's done really well to get herself into that work, hasn't she? In that field.
Yes.
I mean, that's what I think is so interesting. We've got some specimens from some of Leighton's herbarium here in front of us, and it's very interesting that these are some of the species which Mary McGee is cited for. And they come from such a diverse range of environments. You've got, sort of common things like a wild cherry tree, and then you've got some vetch, we've got reeds and rushes, and so all these different types of environment that she's sort of traipsing off to and studying the plants. I mean, you can imagine it's such a sort of damp and cold thing to do, because of course you've got to get out there, haven't you? You can't just go out in the summer or in the spring when it's nice and clement. You've got to get out there in the middle of winter if you want to see the full range of plants that are growing.
Well, and certainly with the number of records that she sent to Leighton, this must have been much more than a passing interest for Mary McGee. She kept at it over a number of years, presumably.
A real passion.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's interesting as well, isn't it, that the dear Ludlow Natural History Society, the organisation which eventually came to found Ludlow Museum, which we're surrounded by the collections of here, that she's there in the minutes of their second annual report, that she's a member of the society, and they very clear-thinkingly allowed women members right from their inception, and so she's in there as well, joining the society and getting in there with all the men folk.
and as a member of the society, she used to take guests into the museum in the late 1830s and early 40s. Yes.
Yes, that's it. Yes, they were allowed in. They were allowed in for free, weren't they? With
At
a certain
one point,
number of
yes,
guests.
that's
Yeah,
right. Yes. Yes.
Great. So this very clearly communicates to us her social status. So this is the notice that was printed by Mr. Griffiths, the local Ludlow printers, at the time of Mary's death, after her death, in July 1844, advertising her house and the contents of her house for sale. And I just love the way it says, genteel furniture, pianoforte, London-built close carriage. That's how she got to find all her botanical specimens, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Driving about in that, a bath chair, and other effects of the late Miss McGee.
So who was Sarah Price?
Well, she was a mycologist, an illustrator and an author. She was born in 1793 in Bitterley, and she died in 1869. She was the daughter of Reverend John Walcott of Bitterley Court and also Vicar of Bitterley. Her mother was Sarah Dashwood. Sarah Price was part of one of the most influential Shropshire families. On her mother's side, Sarah is descended from the poet John Milton, so she's a very eminent and prestigious family ancestry. She grew up in Bitterley Court, just outside Ludlow, and would have been immersed in the refined world of female education, which included the study of nature and illustration as suitable activities for a young lady and vicar's daughter.
Yes, so did she get married?
She did, yep. She married Robert Bell Price of Knighton on the 19th of April 1830 and raised several children with him, in addition to pursuing her interest in mycology. As a vicar's daughter, we can imagine that Sarah grew up immersed in the world of nature and the natural world. Studying the wonder of nature was often seen as a way of acknowledging God's creation and was also one of the new scientific pursuits of botany and geology. And they were often carried out by men, and often men of the cloth, partly one assumes due to the copious leisure time afforded to 19th century vicars. So Sarah was probably educated by a governess, we don't know precisely, but that was common for young women at the time. And growing up, her world would have very much been centred around the home and ensuring that she was seen as a good match for the eligible young men in her social circle. However, her studies of nature seem to have ignited a passion in her for the weird and wonderful world of mycology.
Yes, it's incredible that that's what she chose. I mean, it's a fascinating area, but it's not something you think of as being one of the kind of obvious choices.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of women who were sort of pressing flowers and collecting ferns for the aesthetics.
Yeah.
But mycology is really just a science thing,
Yes,
isn't it?
It's quite niche. We don't really know why she got so fascinated by fungi, but Ludlow and Bitterley are quite some damp environments, aren't they? So, you know, quite good for the production of fungus of all forms. So we know very little about her scientific training. It's likely she was trained in illustration and drawing, as was usual for young women at that time. It's clear from her work that she was a talented artist, but we've no way of knowing how she came to be so fascinated by mycology in particular. I wonder if it was the ephemeral nature of these things. They appear overnight, they're there for a day or so often, and then they disappear completely. Obviously, we know that they don't actually disappear completely. All the mycological web is there underground, but there's that kind of blooming, they are flowers effectively, aren't they? So I wonder if she was just fascinated by these slightly strange and unusual forms that appeared. We can picture her setting off on a damp autumnal morning to go and study what fungi had popped up overnight.
Yes, and I suppose her talents as an artist were really key to that because they're not something that is easy to preserve. We've got small selection within our collection, but they're really hard to kind of keep in a way that you can really appreciate them. So that illustration was really key to recording them.
Yeah, it's an essential part of the study of mycology that, yes, you see them as they are when they're in their prime living state, not sort of 2 days later when they've been gnawed by rodents and sort of half of them is dissolved away. Yeah,
And
fascinating.
Do we know if she was keeping field notes as well, or was it just the illustration side?
I think it's more the illustration side. It seems as if a lot of her, the content of her books don't really stray that much from the sort of accepted knowledge and understanding of mycology at that time. But she did draw from specimens that she collected herself, because she states that in the books. So, you know, that's really, she's not just kind of receiving things or copying something she's seen in someone else's book. She's actually going out there and gathering these specimens herself and drawing them.
Yes. So her writings in the books are suggesting that she's reading up a lot about the development of this science and is sort of keeping right there at the cutting edge of what the latest thinking is.
Yeah, that's it. She's seeing what other people have thought and the ideas that have been generated, and then she's finding the exact specimens she has in her local environment and recording them and publishing them in these wonderful works for posterity.
Yes, yeah. So they're showing a real sort of skill at identification and also about observation and recording.
Yeah, that's it. And of course, these things, many of them, the sort of slightly more obscure species, not the kind of field mushroom that we can all spot. You know, you had to get out there and be there when it appeared. You know, a lot of them don't last more than a day or so. So it's not something you can just think, oh, this is the season, I'll pop out and there's bound to be one there. So yeah, it's fascinating.
And how did these beautiful illustrations come to be published?
So Sarah self-published her books, and she had subscribers who contributed to cover the costs of the publications, and then of course they would get a copy of the publication as part of their subscription. And her two books are Fungi of Our Fields and Woods, parts 1 and 2, published in 1864, and then the second volume in the following year, 1865. She wrote and illustrated both books, and they showcase her scientific endeavours. She clearly used her social position and good standing to facilitate these scientific investigations. The list of subscribers to her books are filled with the great and good, and possibly not so good, of the local Shropshire Society. We've got Beriah Botfield, the local MP, Lord and Lady Clive, the Rouse Bowdens, and various learned and scientific specialists from the local area. The list of subscribers is also, interestingly, dominated by women. So she was supported by a web of women who were interested in her studies and what she was discovering, and keen to see what she had found and to see her beautiful illustrations in print. In the preface to the first book, she expresses her hope that she'll publish another volume, and so it was that she did publish a second volume a year later. This was also self-published and again supported by subscription. And this time, the person thanked in her introduction is one of the most famous naturalists at the time, Dr. Hooker, who was director of the botanical gardens at Kew. He also helped Sarah and supported her mycological adventures.
So she was obviously in contact with some really important scientists of the age.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, she was a well-to-do young woman and older woman, because she pursues this throughout her life. And, you know, she used those social connections that she had, as people do, to pursue her interests and also to help with the publication of the book.
Yes, yeah.
So.
And I think what's nice is it comes back to that idea of women in drawing rooms talking about some really important subjects. It wasn't all sort of frivolous hats and ribbons. It was about the cutting edge of science and about what I've been studying and discovering. So, yeah, it must have been some fascinating conversations going on.
Yeah, exactly. And how proud they must have all been as well to see her books come to print. Of course, that's really her legacy. They're beautiful books, but they're beautifully executed as well. You know, they share so much information, and they're still here for us to study today, which is absolutely amazing that we can have these published works and still get useful information from them for the local area and for Shropshire.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there are a fantastic record of just what fungi were growing in the area at that time. And if that has changed, it gives us an idea about climate change and how the environment within the county has. So, yes, it's a really important snapshot, isn't it?
Indeed, undoubtedly. That's it. And sadly, that sort of view back to the time of Sarah Price is more useful than ever to enable us to see the effects of the era that we're now living in and all the changes which are happening in the environment, because undoubtedly some of these fungi will no longer be able to grow in the local area.
Yes, yeah.
So it seems like Shropshire was at the heart of all these scientific achievements.
Yes, it really was. I mean, you've got the Industrial Revolution and all the great ideas and thinking around that. And you really get this kind of catalyst for thinking wider about other disciplines, including the sciences. And I think what we've seen as we've sort of delved into this further is that there were more and more women involved in this. And it's just that we haven't necessarily identified them and named them until now. And I think the more we work our way through the collections, the more interesting characters we're going to discover.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yes. And I think one of the things that is clear when we've looked at these three women today has been the importance of opportunity. They all came from kind of wealthy families, so they had the finance and the leisure time to actually pursue these areas.
It's that element of time, isn't it, that you needed to have a certain level of comfort without having to go out and work to be able to actually spend time studying the sciences and looking at these things.
Yes, and I think also the attitudes of the men in their lives is, I think each of them has had a father who had an interest as well and shared it with his daughters, that they were willing to support them to continue this. And in particular, people like Sarah Price, it was so important that her husband was supportive of what she wanted to do and was willing to kind of give her the space and the resource to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's very telling that a lot of the women that we've been talking about have been single, is that they were able to sort of create their own sort of agenda and decide what they wanted to do with their time, and within certain confines were able to continue their interests in science. Despite not having access to being able to go to the universities, to being part of the debates that happened within academic circles, or to join a lot of these learned societies that would have allowed them to sort of swap ideas and theories with their peers.
And I suppose that's very telling, isn't it? These women were all interested in various forms of biology, things that are out there in the natural world that can be observed directly by people in the field, rather than it being a pursuit that they had to go to a laboratory or access in a more indirect way.
Yes, so it was sort of research that they could do in their gardens and sort of in the woods and fields beyond, but also using those skills that they had been taught. So the drawing, the observation, and that they were able to sort of develop from that by reading widely and sort of finding out what was being done within those sciences, what were the new ideas, and then thinking, well, how can I apply that here?
Yeah, a fascinating snapshot of Shropshire history and botany, mycology from the past.
Yes.
Captured by these amazing women.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's fascinating that people like Catherine Primley would have probably have met Darwin and had discussions with him, and perhaps a tiny little bit of influence on that young mind, and encouraging them to sort of discover the natural world further. Yeah. And I think what we've seen is that in answer to that original question that set us off on this journey, is that had Darwin been a woman, his experience probably would have been very different. There would have still been the passion and the enthusiasm there, but the opportunities to study, to travel independently, and also to be taken seriously as someone purporting new ideas and theories, probably wouldn't have been there. And I think the story of evolution would have had a footnote with a Darwin next to it, rather than him being the leading light.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it's just really good to be able to shine a light on the contribution of these women. And no doubt the more we look into it and the more other people look into these pioneering female botanists, the more will be discovered about a whole swathe of women who were discovering things and observing things for themselves.
Yes, yeah, it's not just the understanding of the natural sciences of Shropshire, it's the people that actually helped us create these wonderful collections that we have today.
Yeah.